Steve Jobs famously said that no one reads books anymore, which may or may not be true. But his death has actually sparked an avalanche, a library of new books about Jobs and Apple. Last month we had the best-selling author Walter Isaacson, the authorized biographer of Jobs. Last week we had Adam Lashinsky, the author of Inside Apple, a tell-all about its organizational structure. And today we have an author of perhaps the most eccentric, unusual, the oddest book about Steve Jobs, a book called The Zen of Steve Jobs. I want to welcome Caleb Melby, the author of The Zen of Steve Jobs, to TechCrunch TV.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
So Caleb, I ask all my authors this, but with you I really mean it. Do we need to read a book about the Zen of Steve Jobs? And by the way, just for our authors, this is an animated book. This is not a straight textbook, which perhaps Caleb can tell our viewers about.
Yeah, The Zen of Steve Jobs is a graphic novel. And I think one of the reasons why you want to read this, in addition to, say, Walter Isaacson's biography, is because it highlights a part of Steve's life that is very often overlooked. He often, like say in the Stanford address, made references to his Buddhism, but nobody has ever really delved into what that meant for Steve, how much of a Buddhist he was, etc. And as we're all trying to, trying to understand what made Steve great, no aspect should go overlooked. And his religion was really pivotal in helping him understand mostly his design aesthetic.
Caleb, the book is, and I've read it and enjoyed it very much, is a narrative about Steve's relationship with a Buddhist priest he met, 20 or 30 years ago when he was a much younger man. Tell me about that priest and how that relationship evolved.
Yeah, Kobun Atagawa was one of the first Buddhist priests here in the States, and more so than the man who brought him over, Shunryu Suzuki, who is also a Buddhist priest, really took to the post-hippies and the collegiates who were really interested in Buddhism at the time. And Steve and Kobun became really good friends, largely in part because they were both innovators and mavericks in their own fields. Kobun was a Soto Zen Buddhist priest, and the innovations he made in Buddhism back when he knew Steve, and now since he's passed away, you see it in his students as well, are kind of on par with what Steve did in computers. He grew up with corporal punishment in his Buddhist training. We don't often think of corporal punishment as being part of Buddhism, but it was. He didn't bring that with him to the West. And he kind of threw dogma out the window and was really interested in individualized lessons and training for his students. And that, of course, appealed to Steve greatly in looking for somebody who could teach him about Buddhism, which he was interested in, but also design. Kobun was a calligrapher and a designer himself, and the two were able to bounce ideas off of each other that way as well.
Caleb, what was Steve like with his Buddhist friends, with these Zen monks? It's no secret, particularly as a young man, that he was notoriously brutal in some of his personal relationships, short-tempered, horribly honest. Did the Zen Buddhists see a very different side of Steve Jobs?
Not really. I mean, Steve was still the same guy, and we go over this in the book, but in his later years, when he rejoins Apple in the mid-90s, he becomes disconnected with the Buddhist community and with Kobun as well. In a sense, he sort of found what he needed in Buddhism, took it, and used it to create success in Apple, and moved on. Some of the Buddhist priests I interviewed for the story even went so far as to argue that, well, I think it'd be kind of hard to argue that Steve is a Buddhist, or because I was interviewing people last summer. They found that hard to believe. He took what he needed. He wasn't always the most engaged member of the community, and then he essentially moved on.
What did Jobs most learn from Buddhism? Was it its minimalism, which he incorporated into its products and his lifestyle? Did he derive his aesthetic from Buddhism?
Yeah, a lot of what the book focuses around is this Japanese design concept of ma, which deals with humans' relationship with the negative space that surrounds them as well as the space that surrounds them. And something that Kobun helps Steve understand is that we can find meaning and worth and purpose just as much in the things that aren't there as the things that are there. So when you look at products like the iPad, like the iPhone, or even the iPod that really minimalize the amount of stuff that you see, that was really innovative when Steve did all those things, still is. And he took that from his Buddhist training from the design concept of ma, this idea that you can find worth, purpose, and happiness in things that aren't there.
How much impact do you think Buddhism and his relationship with these Zen priests had on Steve? Was he a Buddhist before he was a Buddhist, or did it reshape him?
I think it's hard to say. I mean, as we know from reading other Steve Jobs books as well, he wanted to come of age in the 60s. He really identified with that movement, and of course, he came of age about half a decade to a decade too late. But he experimented with drugs to try and find spirituality in a higher level of thinking. He went to India, which is one of the first places he discovered Buddhism. I think it's safe to say that if Steve was not a Buddhist before he was a Buddhist, he was definitely predisposed to being a Buddhist.
Are you a Buddhist?
No.
What did you learn from writing the book about Buddhism and Steve Jobs?
Well, I grew up Catholic, and dogma is a big thing in Catholicism. And one of the things I learned about Buddhism specifically was the way they empower individual priests, especially somebody like Kobun. And he's able to teach outside of dogma, and I think that really empowered him to identify with people and to draw people in. And if you're, especially in this day and age where, everything is personalized, Buddhism is a religion that's almost sort of, built for that, in the sense that a lot of Kobun students, including Steve Jobs, were able to, develop their Buddhism, if you will, around what they wanted to get out of it. And I found that to be especially compelling.
So you're saying its personalization is deeply subjective. We all come to it. It becomes a kind of mirror.
I would say so. Yeah. In Steve Jobs' case, the mirror that, especially once he rejoined Apple in the 90s, he didn't really look back in the mirror. He again took what he needed and moved on. And as far as the personal reflection, that's also kind of a tenet of Buddhism, was not something that was as all important to him.
Caleb, you're also a contributor to Forbes, so you're very familiar with the business world. Do you think this parable of Jobs and Buddhism should be a lesson for other business leaders who need to have a bigger truth, a more universal series of values if they're to revolutionize their own industries?
It's interesting. I'm not quite sure. Not all businesses operate the way Apple does. Apple is, of course, very different. For Steve, the religion aspect, the Buddhism really informed the design, not so much, say, the business model. And of course, in the States, we have a lot of entrepreneurs who are Christian entrepreneurs who derive some sort of meaning or goal from that faith as well. But in the end, I think it's not so much that they need Buddhism or any religion to drive their success, but some sort of philosophy. And I don't think that necessarily needs to be tethered to religion.
Jobs famously told Walter Isaacson that he wanted his biography written so that his children would be able to read it and read about him. I find that a rather curious and perhaps in some ways rather troubling confession. What was Steve Jobs' relationship with his children when it came to Zen and religion? Did he try to pass this down, or was it something that his kids knew nothing about?
Well, another famous Steve Jobs and his children parable was about the washing machines and about how they had family meetings about, do they want a big industrial washing machine that allows clothes to be washed faster, but maybe does more damage to clothes and uses more water and is therefore less environmentally friendly? Or do they want one that is environmentally friendly, takes more loads to do, but also, protects the clothes? A very strange parable, but I think kind of gets at the essence of that, in that I think Steve wanted maybe not so much the Buddhism, because again, I don't think later in life he was much of a devout Buddhist, but I mean, that still informed his way of thinking, and I think it's clear that he passed that way of thinking down to his children, about thinking more widely than just about efficiency and all those other things that come with consumer products, but thinking more deeply about the things we surround ourselves with and why those things are important.
Caleb, did you ever consider calling the book Zen and the Art of Software Design?
No, we didn't. It was, as I'm sure you can see from reading the book, it really pulls away from Steve Jobs' business life. We bring him into the boardroom a few times, but it's mostly about his relationship with Kobun and the religion. And in that sense, we knew that Walter Isaacson's book was coming out, and we knew that the vast majority of the press would be about his, his success as an entrepreneur. And we wanted to kind of pull away from that for a second and look at this other aspect of Steve.
Well, Caleb Melby, the author of The Zen of Steve Jobs, you've introduced the world to a very, very different Steve Jobs from the one that Walter Isaacson or Adam Lashinsky introduces us to. Congratulations. Thank you so much for appearing on TechCrunch TV. And best of luck with this really engaging and imaginative book. Thank you, Caleb.
Thanks so much, Andrew.